right, so welcome, belated welcome, everyone. My name is Atul Butte. I'm at the University of California, San Francisco, as well as this role across the whole UC health system. It is great to see a lot of new names and faces here, though most of you are not showing your faces yet. CESTI has been running, as I'm sure you've heard, since 2018. That means we're coming up on 4 years of life. Like everything peri-pandemic, that is both longer and shorter than I would have thought for CESTI in 4 years. But I got involved through an invitation from Victor Zhao, and one never says no to an invitation from Victor Zhao. But I was already thinking about problems in my area, my space of data and analytics, and starting to think about how much longer are we as a society going to remain reactionary when all of our amazing technologies, especially those around here in Silicon Valley, enter wider dissemination. How can we create a more consistent framework to look far ahead to see what might be coming ahead of time in a structured, disciplined way? And that's how I got involved here. I'm on the data side and analytics side, and certainly data can enable people, data can also hurt people. And millions of lives now run on the interpretation of data, or sadly in the misinterpretations of data. So all of which makes the role of CESTI more important as tools to gather and interpret data, and all the other technologies we're so great at developing reach maturity and enter the wider world. So we're now moving into session 2, which is public engagement models. The objective here is to really describe what the public engagement efforts are, have been, should be, and highlight a couple of examples of other public engagement efforts within the United States and globally, and discuss how the outputs of those types of public engagement efforts then inform governance. We have 3 speakers that will present for 10 minutes each, and then a moderated discussion. George is already arguing with me that CESTI was born in 2019. I searched my emails. I have them back to 2018. So it is older than we think. I made sure of that. We are going into 3 speakers next, so I can mute. We have Debra Mathews first from Johns Hopkins, Jennifer Kuzma from North Carolina State, and Mahmud Farooque from Arizona State University. And then we get to discussion. So Debra, can I turn it over to you next?
Yes, thank you so much. All right. So in my 10 minutes, I'm both going to sort of frame the conversation about public engagement and then talk about CESTI's thinking and work in this space. So CESTI's work has taken into account the interests and views of 3 key constituencies: individual users in society, drivers of technology, and formal governance actors. And in academic and policymaking circles, we're often better at engaging with these second 2, though we usually understand, and as you've heard already throughout today, that it's critical to engage the public, but we're often at a loss at exactly how to do that. And over the years, there's been an evolution in how we think about public engagement and what it means. Sort of generally from a model of deficit, that the public doesn't know about the science, and so it's our job to inform them or to educate them, to a notion of dialogue with the public, more of a 2-way kind of engagement. A switch from why should we do this to how should we do this. A shift from an understanding that we need to engage the public to an understanding that there are actually multiple publics, and figuring out which public or publics we should be engaging with is actually a pretty tricky and critical part of the process. And a shift from sort of a notion of science in society to responsible innovation. Now, there are many reasons why we should engage the public. They're here. Some of them are here. I'm not going to go through them all, but the harder questions are when should we engage and how should we do that? So I think you heard peers sort of go through some of these stages in the process at which we might think about engaging publics, from identifying the question, designing the research, funding determinations, conducting research, publication, et cetera, down through the governance of actual applications. Although sort of the later you get in this timeline, the more likely you are to be sort of too late to have a big impact. And then how do we engage? Right? I already mentioned that we've come to an understanding of the importance of two-way communication in engagement. It's not just about telling the public about what we're doing, but about a mutual exploration of values. And as Tanya Bubla and others have said, at an honest effort at relationship and trust building rather than persuasion that you should let us do what we want to do. And these should be activities that sort of enable informed decision making. But of course, that implies that there's a decision or a research agenda or a research design that can actually be influenced. And the key questions, or at least some of the key questions, and I think Cinnamon went through all of these as well, and others have mentioned them. What is the goal of any particular engagement activity? What is the product of that activity? Critically, how does that product feed into the policy or decision-making process? And what exactly does successful engagement look like? So attention to the interests and concerns of the general public in society in some ways is sort of baked into much of CESTI's work. And I showed you this slide earlier today, right? Key stakeholders include many, but not necessarily all of the publics with which one might want to engage. Our cross-sectoral analysis explicitly included the ways in which publics engage and shape new technologies in our cross-sectoral analysis. In the framework elements that I went through very briefly and that I'll take a deeper dive into tomorrow, we explicitly call out public engagement and democratic deliberation as sort of key informational elements to any governance framework. And public values play in throughout this process, including, for example, in risk and benefit analysis, right? Because different people, different publics will define risks and benefits differently. So while CESTI wasn't able to engage in sort of that robust two-way engagement that I described a moment ago, we did want to begin to get a sense of the values, interests, hopes, and fears of the public who will have to live in the world that's shaped by these technologies. And the unique structure of CESTI enabled the development and fielding of a public public survey in the context of our work that we hope will provide input to the consensus study and sort of open the door to conversations about the integration of the public and public values into the sort of upstream iterative governance model that CESTI has framed out, and again, that I'll talk about tomorrow. So we designed a survey based in part on the vignettes that begin some of our case studies. One short vignette on gene-edited stem cell treatment for sickle cell disease, and a second one on off-label use of direct-to-consumer neurotechnologies by children. We asked questions with open text fields about risks and benefits that survey respondents identified in these vignettes, and their sort of hopes and fears for these kinds of technologies. We also ask individuals to identify particular benefits or challenges that they or those they know and love have encountered with regard to technology, emerging technologies, and then asked a bit about how they, in an ideal world, would like to engage with governance. Of course, we also asked demographic questions and asked about an opportunity for further engagement. And I did want to point out that this survey was reviewed by the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine IRB and was determined to be exempt. And I am happy to report, peers, that it was not a particularly painful or drawn out process. Thus far, we've reached out to for help with dissemination of the survey from folks at science museums, at historically Black colleges and universities along the Eastern Seaboard, a variety of patient advocacy groups, as well as the National Academy's Twitter account and various listservs within the organization. And more outreach is planned. So I'm just going to go very briefly through some very preliminary results. We have over 275 respondents thus far. We lean female, older, whiter, and more highly educated, which is a common challenge in work like this, although we're continuing to reach out in an effort to diversify the pool of respondents. And I am not claiming that a word cloud is robust data analysis, and word clouds are a little bit 5 years ago, but I wanted to just give a sense of what we're hearing thus far. The risks, and this is in response to the first vignette about gene-edited stem cell treatment for sickle cell disease. The risks here largely focused on, the risks identified largely focused on physical risks, unknown or unintended effects of this intervention, and secondary effects on family and sort of life outside of the medical condition, such as implications for work. That same question for the off-label use of a neurotechnology by children also largely focused on safety, physical risks, unknowns, concerns about addiction, and a focus on the lack of regulation. And then not looking to benefits, but jumping to the question about hopes. What I found interesting here, this picture is just from that first vignette on cell therapy, but this is true of the hopes that people articulated for both kinds of technologies. They frequently focused on not only the treatment of the conditions mentioned in the vignettes, but also translation of these technologies to other serious conditions, such as diabetes and cancer for the cell-based treatment, and dementia and those with brain injuries for the brain-computer interface. And there were also frequent comments regarding concerns about availability or broad access to all and appropriate regulation. And for the question about personal benefits or challenges, I just wanted to share with you a few quotes to give you a sense, again, of the kinds of data that we're collecting. So for the hopes, or personal benefits rather, there were, not surprisingly, lots of mentions of COVID vaccines. Lots of mentions about telemedicine and Zoom. Zoom also figured in the challenges. But here, mentions both telemedicine and vaccines, also wastewater monitoring, and a desire for self-driving cars when this person's too old to drive. New immunotherapy treatments were used by a family member with cancer. My mother likes seeing family on FaceTime. Telemedicine and teletherapy being important to help with mental health issues during the pandemic, and particularly to get to harder to reach populations, such as here highlighted, working with incarcerated individuals, although there's a concern about a loss of human connection. Glucose monitor, a continuous glucose monitor connected to cell phones for the management of this individual's son's type 1 diabetes. 3D printer, so this example is not a medical example, although 3D printing is used in the medical field as well, and its benefits for small businesses. And then again, another mention about insulin regulating devices, but also giving amputees the possibility of having control over their prostheses through brain-computer interfaces. And then finally, on personal challenges, again, a broad range. Also, telemedicine came up in challenges, right? It makes quality in-person visits less common, potentially replacing a poorer but more convenient form of practice for a better one. Computer connectivity affecting lots of things you'll see across a couple of these quotes, but including wrong information and widely spreading conspiracy theories. Concerns about folks with dementia being unable to use computer-based conveniences that are easier for others of us to engage with. The cost of new technologies. Lots of concerns about the impact of social media on mental health and our ability to focus, etc. Concerns about the security of digitized information and privacy. Racist algorithms that reinforce existing biases. The concerns about, again, accessibility of the benefits of telemedicine, for example, for the deaf and hard of hearing community. And then the side effects of some advances. And I should note that this person on the benefit side talked about her husband benefiting from the therapy, and then on the challenge said, but the drug suppress his immune system, and so he has kidney dysfunction and osteoporosis. So as I mentioned before, we'll continue recruiting with a particular focus on younger folks and people of color to try to improve the diversity across a range of metrics in our survey participants. And we plan to both publish the results and submit our findings to the consensus study. And I look forward very much to hearing the next two speakers.
Excellent. We're going to hold off questions for now until we get to the discussion. So the next speaker is Jennifer Kuzma from NC State. Jennifer, are you there?
Yeah, Atul, yesterday they changed the agenda, so Mahmud is going to go before me. So
Mahmud.
We worked it out in the opposite direction. Sorry about that.
No worries, Mahmud,
Okay.
You're next. Great.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Are you able to see?
It's working great.
Okay, great. So it's been really an honor to be joining this panel and this very distinguished range of speakers on this conference. I've been listening intently from the morning. So I'm here. I'm very happy to get the opportunity to share an approach to public engagement that my colleagues at Arizona State University and the Museum of Science, with partnership with federal agencies, philanthropic sponsors, and international organizations, have been developing over the last dozen years. So just to start by recognizing that the demand for public engagement has been strong, growing, and spreading. And from the national academies to the private sector to legislative branches, there are increasing calls for engaging the broader public, not only at the end of the scientific process, but in the upstream as well as the midstream. But are they all talking about the same thing? If we think more deeply and bring some academic disciplinary thinking to it, we are essentially talking about addressing three types of failures of our socio-technical decision-making system. First, failure to manage uncertainty in case of high decision stakes and value conflicts, failure to include the most vulnerable communities in our democratic decision-making, and failure to integrate public values in science policy decision-making. So our thinking about this starts with a two simple proposition. My French colleague Yves Mathews calls this the presumption of competence, that lay public have valuable knowledge and perspectives to share, and including them in deliberative and democratic processes lead to better societal outcomes. So what my colleagues and us, we proposed belongs to a class of tools called participatory technology assessment. It is an engagement model that seeks to improve the outcomes of science and technology decision-making through dialogue with informed citizens. It's a tool that we think has the potential to help us better assess public values, manage uncertainty, and also help fill democratic gaps. So how do you make it all work? So we've been talking about these sort of things for a long time. In 2010, we got tired of all the effort to bring back the Office of Technology Assessment and so forth. A group of colleagues at the ASU and other places proposed a distributed institutional framework in the name of expert and citizen assessment of science and technology, which will combine academic research, informal science education, and nonpartisan policy analysis. So specifically, the idea was to add public participation with expert assessment, which was the topic of the previous panel. It will integrate diverse values and perspectives. It will constantly learn and innovate, and it will be integrated in policymaking, research, and development in broader societal dialogues. So after a demonstration project providing citizen input to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, ECAS piloted its first PTA project in 2014 with NASA on its asteroid initiative. So ECAS portfolio now includes projects on climate intervention research, automated vehicle futures, gene editing, and they're supported by public agencies and philanthropies. So the current ECAS process, as I mentioned, we are continuously learning and innovating. It looks like this. It's essentially 3 deliberative activities: problem framing, ECAS deliberation, and then results and integration. The problem framing step usually involves literature reviews, interviews, open framed focus groups, and all leading to a design workshop with experts and stakeholders. The purpose of the workshop is to understand similarities and difference between public framing of the problem and also the expert framing, and figure out who should be engaged, what kind of questions to ask, what information to provide, what type of data to collect, and so forth. The deliberative step is usually for us is a day-long engagement, about 100 representatively diverse citizens who are also provided a stipend to ensure that we have balanced representation and diversity captured in our population. They sit at tables of 6 to 7 with the facilitator and go through several rounds of discussions and sharing. The third step also involves multiple rounds of analysis and engagement, just like with the survey that Debra just mentioned. There are different layers of information that we can sift through. And it also involves engagement with stakeholders, beginning with another, what we call results integration workshop. Now, one thing I want to point out, it's important to note that we see these as not one-off, though on project-to-project basis, it does look like this. We see it as an iterative and integrated approach going forward. So in terms of data, we usually collect, demographic data, pre and post surveys, groups. Because like I said, we work with science museums. These are very interactive and engaging dialogues. There's activities, there's individual and group responses, and there's also recordings, and we also conduct interviews. So what has been some of the results? So I will group them into 2 types. One is obviously when we do public engagement, we are increasing our general understanding, and these are reports and publications that we generate. But the outcomes in terms of impact on policy and decision making depends on the particular audience. And different audience also has very different value proposition. So it's not just one report leading to one set of decisions. We found a range of value propositions to which we keep adding, from understanding public priorities to even noticing, anticipating emerging issues and looking at unanticipated outcomes, because public makes connections that experts don't, and sometimes that leads to interesting places. We've also seen some impact on governance. That's the process, and the GAO report on open governance and the recent OMB report on equity both mentioned this process as one of the better practices for the federal agencies. Now, in terms of actual impact in governing, we can point to only one example so far, the deliberation that we did with NASA, led to the realization the role that public was expecting NASA to play in terms of planetary defense. That is, if an asteroid was going to come in our direction, what to do about it and who should do something. So that generated a conversation in NASA, and that ultimately led to the creation of the Office of Planetary Defense, which was most recently featured in the Oscar-nominated movie Don't Look Up. Now, I'll quickly give you a little flavor of what it looks like. We just completed conducting a project on human gene editing anticipatory governance, led by, it's funded by NIH and led by Chris Scott at Baylor and Cynthia Celine at ASU. As you can see, the public engagement part is in the middle of a scenario development work, the foresight and anticipation work and the governance proposal. And so specific to this project, following our 3 steps model, we did some open framing focus group where we had some very interesting findings about, public framing, about thinking about this. And then when, we even asked them to draw pictures of healthcare system. As you can see, somebody drew a bunch of musical chairs. So the concerns there more about access and affordability, equity, justice, and so forth, and also autonomy. Which was somewhat different than thinking about in terms of somatic versus germline editing or therapy versus enhancement. We conducted our expert design workshop because this was during COVID time. We used both synchronous and asynchronous mode, and it helped us design our public forums, which were held in September through November of last year. There were in-person forums in Boston, Phoenix, and also Waco. And then we had an online forum. So overall, we engaged about 150 participants. The agenda looked like this. It started with an open framing. We talked about gene editing and possible futures, and ultimately ended with sharing hopes and concerns. Just to give you an example of what goes in, it's in terms of creating informed public and these dialogues, it's pretty intense. There's lots of materials created, from videos to, we have character cards that bring out the perspective from a more human way and allows us to bring in empathy and other dimension to the discussions. Obviously, there's background information that each participant receives before the forum. So we're now in the results and integration phase. We just published the first briefing book on our preliminary results and had first stakeholder dialogues in March 22nd, I believe. So that's about it from my end. Just to set our conversation. I gave a 30,000 level feet of what we do. If you're interested in more on ground level, here are some references. And thank you.
Excellent. Again, we're going to hold off on questions and then go to our 3rd speaker, and then open this up for discussion. So Jennifer Kuzma is next, and I think you're already starting to share your screen. Perfect.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let me just see if I can get the slideshow up here. Okay. Does that look all right?
Yep, it's working.
Perfect. Okay, well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited that CESTI is embarking or initiating this study. It's really an important area, and very excited to see NAM get into this space of how we integrate public values with governance of emerging technologies. I just want to say a few words. Our Genetic Engineering and Society Center has done a lot of practical, on the ground kind of stakeholder and public engagement events. We integrate the social sciences, humanities, and natural sciences and engineering together, not only among the faculty, but we also have an integrated graduate research program, graduate training program in this area. And I'm not going to be talking about our engagement events, but I just would point you to our website. If you want to see the reports, Jason Delborn, Katie Barnhill-Dilling, Kara Grieger, Todd Kukin when he was with us, and others at our center, and I have all done this type of engagement. Now, what I'm going to be talking about, however, though, is kind of the problem that we have with public inclusion and engagement in governance. And I see that problem that we have a lot of these ad hoc events, but they're not integrated into where the rubber hits the road in decision making, and they don't have power or teeth in the actual course of technology development. So that's going to be the feature of my talk today. Okay. So I'm going to back up just one slide here. So I'd like to frame the opportunities and the barriers to public engagement and governance according to the innovation pipeline along 3 phases. Now, I recognize that innovation isn't necessarily linear, but I think it presents a useful framing for considering the different types of models that one might use for public and stakeholder inclusion and engagement, as well as the challenges in each of the stages. So the first I'll be talking about is sometimes what we consider upstream engagement, or how do we bring the public voice, the diverse values of the public into the actual research and innovation process itself at early stages upstream. And I'm going to just talk about one model for each of these stages in detail, because it's just in the interest of time. So the model that I'd like to talk about here for upstream engagement is responsible research and innovation, which was alluded to by several of the other speakers today. So for those of you who aren't familiar, I like this definition from Owen et al. In 2013, an interactive process through which stakeholders become mutually responsive to the other with respect to ethics, sustainability, and social desirability of the processes and products resulting from research and innovation. And I also like the framing by Stilgo et al. In the same year, according to 4 key principles. Now, there are more principles. There's a lot of definitions of responsible research and innovation, but we use these 4 principles to study the barriers to responsible research and innovation. And we had a National Science Foundation grant that really focused on barriers, and we typed the barriers at the micro level, meso level, and macro level. So these 4 principles are anticipation, I'm not going to read them all, inclusion, reflexivity, and responsivity, with responsivity being the most important and I think the most difficult in governance. And that is taking the results of anticipation, inclusion, and reflexivity and bringing them into actually being responsive to societal values and concerns in the course of research and innovation. So to summarize the work of several articles that my colleagues and I have written somewhat recently, from 2018 to 2021, we did focus groups, we did surveys, and we did a lot of qualitative and quantitative analysis, and found that, at the micro level, really the attitudes of different stakeholder groups present somewhat of a barrier to responsible research and innovation. For example, deficit thinking among researchers and innovators, that the public can't understand the technology, and if they're given any control or voice, that they'll make poor decisions. Also, it's not our responsibility. We're just doing the research. It's not our responsibility to engage early. That's for the later stages. And then also, if we open up the doors, we might face public backlash, and we might evoke more concern about the technologies. Now, at the meso level, which is more the institutional level, there's really a lack of capacity for integrating RRI. And there's the risk of losing investments in your technology, whether they be grants or venture capital. Our reward structures don't incentivize it. And at the macro level, we talk about more public policy at the national or international level, that funding structures are pretty rigid, that there's a competition for funding, the pace of innovation. We always want to compete in the global technology race. And things that slow innovation at all, including the need to practice RRI, have really been seen as a threat to competitive growth. And I think we need to change this somehow. So a lot of my work in recent times has been, well, how can we get public policies to promote RRI on the national agenda? But first, let me talk about just our work on the micro level attitudes. We looked in quantitative surveys and found a really strong association between the core values or the cultural values of a person and what they feel about responsible research and innovation. And those holding more egalitarian beliefs tend to favor more the principles and practices of responsible research and innovation. And those that have more hierarchical or individualistic beliefs are less favorable towards the principles and practices of responsible innovation. Also, it's sector related. So industry and trade organizations that are affiliated with industry also tend to have less favorable attitudes towards the practices, especially of RRI. So this model sort of summarizes some of this work, and it was published in 2020, in that there's quite a bit of discrepancy in these kind of what we call them coalitions of consumer groups, advocacy groups, and industry and trade along deep core beliefs. There's an association. There's also an association with the differences on especially the principles of inclusion and responsivity, which give more power and control to the public or to public engagement. However, there is quite a bit more agreement on anticipation and reflexivity, and there's a lot less agreement on implementation or practices of RRI. So how do we bring these groups together in tighter coalitions so we can collaborate? And I think that's a very kind of deep philosophical question, as well as a practical policy question. So this is an in review paper, but I took a look at policy process theory and trying to see how can we get this on the agenda. And I think it was Gary who mentioned it early in the day that often we need a crisis. In public policy theory, we call this a focusing event. So it's either a big mishap or it's a big media event or something. And unfortunately, we don't want to get to that point. We want to get it on the agenda earlier than that. But some other ways are shifting the policy image of RRI so that it's not seen so much as a barrier or a threat, but more of an opportunity or something to enhance technology rather than to stifle it, or creating new policy venues. So that's this box on the side. But overall, the policies that we really need are national funding and incentives to overcome some of these barriers and to change the way that research and development is evaluated. So can we not only compensate for the lost time in potentially with RRI, but can we overcompensate? Can we incentivize it? So that summarizes kind of this particular stage. So I'd like to move on now to the next stage, is public engagement in regulation and oversight. And there are many models, including, I think, a really nice NRC study in 1996, understanding risk in the analytical deliberative process. So inclusion of interested and affected parties in risk assessment itself. I wrote a model called Procedurally Robust Risk Assessment Framework using the case study of the Oxitec mosquito for for dengue and Zika control. But what we currently do is we have notice and comment on proposed rulemaking, especially for emerging biotechnologies, especially in the non-medical space, but possibly public health space or food and health integrative space. There is really a lack of venues for this in regulation and oversight for any public voice outside of the Federal Register. We've had very few federal advisory committees recently on big decisions like the release of the first Oxitec mosquito, the approval for food of the GalSafe pig. But not to beat up on the regulatory agencies, because as Gary mentioned, they lack the legal authority, they often lack capacity, and they also have to protect confidential business information in the regulatory process. So these are some pretty big barriers. However, as others have mentioned, I think it was Debra, risk assessment itself even is not 100% based on science. You can't base a risk assessment, a decision from a risk analysis on science alone. Our data is usually high doses in short times, but what we really care about are kind of low exposures over long periods of time. So we make a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of uncertainty. But even not, who gets to define what a risk is? Who gets to define whether we're being more promotional or precautious when we interpret risk information? So there really needs to be a place for the public engagement in the regulatory domain and the risk assessment process. So one of the models I alluded to was this procedural robust risk assessment framework, which really bases itself on responsible research and innovation principles Sheila Jasanoff's Technologies of Humility, as well as the International Risk Governance Council's criteria for emerging risk governance. And I won't go into this, but essentially it makes the case that with gene drives and some of these emerging technologies, the uncertainties and ambiguities are going to be so great that's what really is most important is the procedural validity and really integrating these diverse voices and values into the interpretation of the scientific information. But this is from an article I wrote in the Hastings report. We have piecemeal authorities for biotech products, and there's a lack of coordination. And so I propose that we have some supra-agency structures to really convene engagement. And just to throw something out there, I thought maybe a one-stop shop. It was actually suggested by the National Academies Committee that I was on in 2017. But they didn't recommend the OSTP. I'm taking it a step further and saying maybe OSTP is the place for it if it can maintain public trust and project a more neutral stance on biotech innovation, or better yet, contract with a third-party independent organization. So this is the figure from the National Academies report, Preparing for Future Biotechnologies, where the more unfamiliar or complex that something gets, the more we really have a mandate to engage interested and affected parties and outside experts in this space. So we might not be, we might have to do it for every gene edited product out there, but for the first release of the gene drive or the Oxitec mosquito or the first gal-safe pig, that it would be important to do that. So that's just one model out there. I'll just very quickly talk about the deployment phase because I realize I'm running out of time. Again, there are many models to engage people more on the downstream end of things. There's an incredible lack of transparency for most non-medical related biotech products. And my case studies that I usually work on are gene edited animals and plants. There's a basic lack of transparency, hard to find information on what's on the market. Our labeling laws are not necessarily going to apply to animal products, for example, things that USDA has authority to. Information is often blacked out of regulatory submissions because of confidential. So transparency is essentially the floor for engagement. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And we do know that with these exemptions for some categories of gene edited products, and with the lack of labeling, or even if it is labeled, a QR code is one of the options under the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standards. We do know that people perceive higher risk the less control they have with Paul Slovik's work and the more unknown things are to them. So how do we increase transparency? One model my colleague Kara Grieger and I wrote about was a multi-sector coalition for basically a repository of the kinds of products that are out there with stakeholder advisory groups and public advisory groups and a certification process. So kind of like instead of a green certification, more a transparency certification. So that's pretty much it for my talk. But in summary, we need policy innovation in order to marry engagement with governance. Our biggest barriers are the non-expert expert biases and how the groups feel about each other, political will, and we need for policy focusing events. And then the other barriers I've talked about already and are summarized on this slide. And here's the references that I'll provide to the committee for not only my work, but the other work I cited in this talk as well. So again, thank you for inviting me, and I'm very excited to hear from the rest of the speakers and that this study is taking place.
Okay, thank you for you three speakers for some great thoughts. We have exactly 30 minutes to launch into discussion here. I've heard the discussion has been robust all day so far, so I'm hoping we have equally robust discussion here. There are already two questions, now three. No, back to two questions in the Q&A box. I'm wondering, why don't I assign one of you to read it and then give some thoughts? Maybe we can do it that way. Todd Quicken has a question about, obviously a lot of value in engaging the public in input, but then they're rarely actually formally brought onto, for example, expert committees. Could the panel comment on how or if the public gets on committees like CESTI and obviously other technologies as they're being assessed more than just a survey for the input, or actually having them as members of the committee? I know, for example, the public serves on our IRBs as one example. And whether any lessons are learned from how IRBs are operated by public governments. Okay, he exactly mentions that. Why don't we go, I don't know, let's be creative and go in reverse order. Jennifer, do you want to comment on this first?
About why the public is not engaged in committee like
Or-
CESTI?
Oh, or even beyond. Well, yeah, there's us.
Or any other committee.
Or any other,
really.
yes.
And I mean, I do think that there have been some FDA and other advisory committees that do have patient group representatives. But I think for a committee, I would love to see the national academies move more in that direction, where they have representatives of diverse publics on committees. And maybe you'd have your study committee, but then you'd have an advisory committee to the study committee. So I think there's a lot of models that you could think about there. I would love to see, because I really like Mahmud, if you're part of some of these participation events, you really see how the public has a lot to offer and will ask really insightful questions to not only diversify your understanding, but also to improve the quality. So I'll just say that.
No, perfect. Mahmud, what do you think? And let me just point out, I think you are the only one who used this phrase informed citizen. I'm curious what informed means, but what do you think about this first comment so far from Todd?
Yeah, I'll go take it a step further. Jennifer was talking about OSTP and having institutionalized, because we now have, for instance, in FERC, there's an Office of Public Participation. So those are kind of steps in the right direction. The problem, the challenge is the administrative laws prevent you from doing a lot of these things. We stumbled upon something called the Paperwork Reduction Act, and even the definition of public. Because we do selection, right? It's an open application, but then we select who we want to bring into the discussion. That's not how public, is defined. So there's a lot of bureaucratic hurdles, but I think we should work towards that principle and take baby steps and opportunities where they come, be more like Jennifer was saying, policy entrepreneur, and we thought that's what's actually making the differences in the agencies where we have worked. It's those entrepreneurs who are kind of trying to innovate within the, opportunities that they have.
Debra, what do you think, being with this process for so long?
Yeah, no, I love Jennifer's suggestion of sort of a public advisory committee, in part because, as I mentioned, it's not, and others have mentioned, it's not just one public. So to have one public representative on a committee, I don't know exactly what that means, right? And that's a lot to put on one person. But to have an advisory committee that has a broader range of public members, I think that could be really productive. We have seen in the biomedical space more of a movement to public involvement, as Jennifer alluded to, with patient advocacy groups, right? There are routinely now representatives from patient advocacy groups in lots of different committees, including on National Academies committees. But I think that the idea of an advisory group is particularly appealing, just because you could get a broader array of views input into the process.
But even such groups aren't exactly the public either. They represent patients, let's say, or represent a constituency. It is challenging. I love that point of what exactly is the definition of public. In the same way, I think a phrase goes back almost 15 years, this concept of a professional patient, who tends to serve on IRBs and tends to join trials. I'm worried about professional advisors, right? The same folks coming again and again to these. How do you actually reach the public?
That's part of the reason I like the broader group as opposed to the individual, right? Because you do on IRBs sometimes end up with someone who most people wouldn't define as a general public representative, right? I think there's less risk of that if you have a broader group of people.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Atul, but I don't want us to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And often we talk about public engagement like it has to be perfect, and we, science isn't perfect. And so we can innovate and experiment with different models. And so, yeah, we may not reach all publics or even the majority of them, or even have the perfect composition, but that doesn't prevent us from forming expert committees. So I don't know. It's just a thought I have. Yeah.
Absolutely. Greater than zero is still better than zero if we're ignoring the public in many of these efforts. Okay, there's already a second question from Jeff Lomax from California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, which I know well. I'll read it. I'm simultaneously cheering for broader authority for the public sector to engage around medical innovation, but also feeling trepidation after seeing so many public officials attacked for vaccine engagement. In such a contentious culture, how can we make the process safe for the messenger and all involved? So here, public, meaning public officials, let's say elected representatives of the public, but also, public participants here aren't necessarily always anonymous or confidential. How do we make this a welcoming type of participatory activity instead of being doxxed at home and things like that for participating in things like this? I don't know, let's reverse it up again. Debra, you want to go first on this one? What do you think?
Sure. Well, first, I think that if you have people in a room together face to face, they're actually much nicer to each other than we can be on.
Than Zoom?
And there are people like Mahmud and Jennifer who do this for a living and have models for constructively engaging folks. And I think that there is a ton to be learned there.
Mahmud, what do you think? How do we make it safer?
For the public official, I'm not really concerned about public official that much, because I think the challenge that that we have is to socialize the idea that these are actually, you can create safe spaces, you can have these dialogues. That's what, like even especially when we are trying to deal with private sector companies, trying to bring them in the conversation, they're afraid of exposure. On the public sector side, what we see is that they don't want to hear from the usual suspects again. There's those professional people who just show up any public meeting. They want to hear from rest of the country. So how do you kind of create those safe spaces? And it's not just randomly picking somebody from the street and bringing them. There's a lot of, you need to kind of create that situation where there can be mutual exchange. So that's why, to answer, you talked about informed, that's why we put a lot of emphasis on a basic level understanding, to have an informed conversation rather than, it's, mostly emotional reaction. But face-to-face makes a lot of difference. And one of the regret we have during the COVID is that we had to do a lot of this engagement online and the results were not as good.
Yeah, Jennifer, what do you think? I mean, I was hit by your slide relevant to this. Sound science is not value free. Who gets to define what the risk is? I think that is part of the issue here with the, let's say pick on the vaccine issue for a moment. Who gets to decide when there's enough information? How do you make a safe process itself, deciding what is safe?
I think that is part of the problem. Well, not maybe not the biggest one, but part of the problem with the whole COVID and controversies is that there is this interpretation of the uncertainty. And I think, well, I don't have the answer to Jeff's excellent question, but I do think one of the things that we need to educate all of us about, not only non-experts, but also experts, is that the scientific process comes with a lot of uncertainty, and we need to, we tend to say, well, let the science tell us what to do, and the science really never can tell you exactly what to do. And I think we need to kind of start bringing that message back a little bit. And I hate to say that because I'm not an anti-science person either, or this anti-vax, anti-science culture. That's not what I'm talking about. But there's this middle ground here that I think we really need to open up our eyes and other people's eyes and the public's eyes, And maybe through dialogue, this will be better. But also, I do think I talked a lot about the biases of experts towards, non-experts, but then there's also, we need to really figure out how are they feeling about the experts themselves and try to really understand where they're coming from. A lot of it is skepticism. They've seen technologies evolve in the past and they didn't turn out how the experts said they were going to turn out. So we need to rebuild that trust somehow. And I don't have the answers, but those are just some random thoughts on this issue.
No, I think one of your last slides did point out reduce expert, non-expert biases.
Yeah.
I was hoping you had a solution to that one.
No,
but it's certainly much harder than it seems there for sure.
Yeah.
And that's really leading to people feeling personally threatened right now. I think that's what's leading to that question.
Absolutely.
More than ever
sad.
before. Yeah, very sad. And really, we want to kind of prevent that, obviously, for future technologies and development. All right, we have another question in the Q&A. Just a quick reminder to everyone listening, type in your questions in the Q&A. They don't have to be long. We can kind of read between the lines, so any questions are good questions. David Winnikoff writes, public engagement in the forms we've been discussing may not get at the goal of producing a deliberative public, okay? So he's setting up the levels here. Public engagement is one level. A deliberative public is a higher level, I suppose. The construction of a deliberative space that can inform policymaking of all kinds. Should a deliberative democracy be the ideal here, or does public engagement capture it? Now we're really, again, perfect and enemy of good here. Jennifer, why don't we start with you, since you were thinking that way?
Well, I'd love to hear Mahmud's thoughts on this too, because he actually integrates in this space more than I do. But I do think, again, it depends on your worldview. I do think for some things, deliberative democracy would be ideal. However, I don't, again, think that that's feasible for every technology, but I think for the major ones that we're putting out there in the marketplace the first time, looking at how do we want our scientific futures to evolve, I think, to me personally, that is ideal, but not for every maybe product or innovation that comes after in that category. So I think there could be tiers, to be a little bit more realistic about it. But, for gene edited plants and animals, I am just looking at for basic information at this point. Our field, unlike the medical innovation field, is so far lacking in transparency that, in my opinion, that, I'd be happy just with baby steps at this point.
Mahmud, what do you think? Deliberative democracy. Yes, go ahead.
So the world that we live in is actually coming from the STS, the Social Study of Science, Deliberative Democracy and Public Administration. The challenge that we have, so first of all, I totally agree with David, and we're trying to do that at scale by doing this museum partnership. So we're trying to build this museum network and capacity, and we can actually scale these things, Museum of Science and so forth. They have done it 200, 400 museums on synthetic biology and all of that. So we have the backbone, but museum is city-centric. We are still not going to the community level. So that's the kind of next challenge. The problem with, dealing scientific problem with deliberative democracy is a little bit challenging because you have upstream, midstream, and downstream level questions. Upstream is should we or should we not do it? Okay, you can have a citizen assembly, you can just do it. But when you go to midstream, it's evolving and it's changing. It's how we do it, what's going to be. Deliberative democracy, it's not like abortion. That's their shining example. Ireland, they decided the abortion issue through citizen assemblies. So there are other deliberative processes, not the citizen assembly model, that can deal with it. So I like the principle of integrating. We are trying to build this capacity, but we still need to be going level deeper in the communities. And, and like Jennifer says, just keep taking steps towards that. Don't wait for the perfect here.
I love that answer. And I love that we're engaging museums through this. As you know, public museums are more than 2,000 years old. But I'm also worrying, are we trying to fight viral social media against or for certain things with museums, right? I wonder the public, what an engaged public or what an informed public is sometimes what is just the last 15 minutes they read on WhatsApp, for example. I know my family, for example. I'm a little worried that the pace of how the public can sway on things happens second to second. Debra, any thoughts on David Winnicoff's point here, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first, I agree with what the other panelists have said, but it depends on the use of deliberative democracy approaches, depends on what your goal is for the particular engagement activity and where in the process you are, just as Jennifer was saying, right? If you're really early, and Mahmud, if you're really early upstream, maybe a deliberative democracy process on, what how you should design this research protocol isn't the right approach for that particular goal, right? But for the first use of gene-edited mosquitoes, absolutely. There are lots of different tools and approaches, and we have to find what fits for the goal and stage that you're at.
Yeah, exactly. And the first release of something is the big one. Keith Dwelu has his hand up from Princeton. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful panel discussion. And I had a question that was catalyzed by Jennifer's observation that at the micro level, that is to say, really far upstream, you identified cultural challenges in making equity and engagement matter. And what you found, a sense that like the public just could not be trusted to make thoughtful decisions, that it is just simply not our responsibility to take those things into consideration. And you mentioned, like, if you open the door, where could this lead? And I was wondering if you and other panelists had ideas about how incentives might matter in changing that outlook. Like, what sorts of interventions might matter in altering those apparently deeply rooted ideas that there's a fundamental tension between public engagement and the early stages of innovation.
Yeah, and that was what my article that was in reviews trying to get at. And I really think, because our technologies are really under a capitalist framework, I think monetary incentives are important, tying venture capital to responsible research and innovation. And maybe people still have those attitudes, but if they are compensated and overcompensating, I mean, maybe initially there's a lot of people that might want to do it, but still need that compensation. So I don't want to brush everybody in the same bin, but I think financial incentives, funding incentives, either in grants or in contracts or in venture capital, are really, from a policy standpoint, is what we're seeing. And even though some of those attitudinal barriers might still be there, they may be overcome by the more that they're exposed to it and they see the value monetarily and quality value to it. I don't know. That's just my thought.
Any other thoughts from the other two?
Are you talking about the public participants, or are you talking about the scientists and researchers? I'm not quite sure.
I was talking about to implement responsible research and innovation in early stages. Like, why would a company do that? Or why would a public developer of technology do that? I'm talking about compensating them. I mean, obviously you should compensate the participants for their time as well, I feel, but I'm talking more about incentivizing it so that we can overcome those technology developer attitudes towards it being a barrier.
Yeah, so in our experience, it has been, again, I go back to the idea of socializing. So for instance, when we were doing on autonomous vehicles, the head of research at Toyota came to give the keynote. And she was very, very skeptical about this whole thing we were doing. She says, okay, I'm going to just sit at a table. And then she stayed there the whole day. And then she invited me at the TRB to present our results. The thing is, she said, what you guys are getting there, there's no marketing or nothing we can do, we can get to that. So because we want to know the mental model, that what is the value people bringing into here, not the exact specific feature that a car has. So that is invaluable. But to get to them to that point, how do we create incentive for that? So the same thing happens with scientists. I think we've done enough about public understanding of science. Public gets it. I don't know we have done enough about scientist understanding of the public, because there's still a lot of resistance. In 20, and I'm on a National Academy thing now, But in 2012, when we did the biodiversity engagement, the Coastal Science Museum could not become an official partner because it was not approved, went through a committee. So now it's welcome that the committee reports and everything is saying about public engagement, but there's still a lot of convincing we need to do on this side as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I've had lots of scientists express those views to me as well. But I also think that getting them in a room, sitting them at a table, and having the discussion about shared values and about how values differ, and getting scientists to acknowledge that scientific values are still values, and they're not the only important values in the innovation process.
Yeah, and to clarify, I think you're right, Mahmud. There are really great actors out there and who are innovators who want this information, what's the public thinking. But I'm talking more about the real integration of responsivity needs to be incentivized sometimes, or a lot of the times. Like, am I going to change the course of my technology development because there's a particular, let's say, marginalized population that is telling me that they don't want it and they're concerned about it and it may harm their culture or their society? Then am I going to change my direction? I think that's what needs that overcompensation part.
Now, and on CESTI, we had many discussions about aligning. How do we align incentives to ensure that technologies move in the direction that maximizes social benefit? And you will have seen, you saw it pop up in my slides, it'll pop up again tomorrow. And it was really critical to our thinking and how we think it might be possible to do this going forward.
I do point out, so it is a capitalistic issue here in many of this. And there are certain industries, certainly, that do engage the public in research and development, right? Focus groups, early product work, but not on the ethics of what they're doing, and not certainly as early stage, right? Because at least seemingly there is no incentive to do that, right? If the market were to want that to happen earlier, then I think then perhaps industries would respond in that way. And certainly it's variable across industrial areas. Maybe an issue is how to get the market to want more ethical, more fair types of development of products and technologies being developed, and thus industries would respond, I suppose.
But it's not just the technologies, right? It's further upstream with the scientists, where there are no incentives for scientists to engage with the public at any point in time, right? It's not rewarded with grants. It's not rewarded with tenure and promotion. There's no time to do it when you're a completely soft money researcher.
Yep, so solve everything by the funding. We could just add a line to our NIH grants to engage the public, and if you put a zero there, that doesn't look good, I suppose. So we could always think about the usual kind of incentives that way that we could cook up. There are a bunch of questions. Go ahead, Mahmud. Mahmud next, and then Keith Yamamoto next. Go for it.
So it's not a lot of data point, but I teach a course on public interest technology. There are people leaving the tech sector because they're not happy with what's going on because of the ethical, and they want to bring in this reflexivity. They're going back to school. At least my few examples that I have, these are bright kids, that Apple and Google's are fighting over, but they want to, bring in, they know something's wrong, but they don't know how to, address it. So if it becomes a talent issue, then markets will definitely pay attention.
Absolutely, I'm only laughing because today on Twitter, literally the phrase "leaving Twitter" is trending on Twitter because of today's news. And perhaps what that means for that company and its ethical principles. Let's go to Keith Yamamoto next here.
Great, thanks, Atul. I was struck, like as you were, Atul, with Jennifer's slide that said that good science is not value free, and Debra just pointed out. Debra just said scientific values are values. And I'd like to explore that a little bit and think about have the panelists explore that a bit and think about the implications that has for public engagement or driving a dialogue between scientists and the public, or the necessity of that dialogue. And I guess I was struck by it because Atul's heard me say this before. I've thought of science and technology as being value free, that the good scientific experiment isn't intrinsically good or a bad thing. It's how that knowledge is used and then driven out into the public domain. And so it doesn't lessen my feeling of an imperative for engagement of the public in discussing these things, but it does have an implication for, in a way, it sort of implies, well, the scientists aren't going to get it right, and so the public has got to step in and take over. So the countermanding views here are that some people in the public look at scientists and say, make sure you get this right because it's going to affect my life, and others. And what I'm hearing you say is the scientists are not going to get it right. And it's a little more of an accusation than you meant it, but the scientists are not going to get it right, so the public has to, as opposed to just agreeing that there needs to be a productive dialogue, that scientists don't have all the information that are needed, neither does the public, and so the dialogue is really essential. So maybe you can just flesh out a little bit your views about good science is not value-free, scientific values are values.
Debra, do you want to go first? It's such a deeply philosophical question.
Yeah, I mean, first I would start by agreeing wholeheartedly with the last thing you said, Keith, about what it really is about is honest engagement and dialogue, right? I am absolutely not saying that all scientists are bad. I'm a geneticist by training. I love science. I think science is critical to human endeavor, but the idea that of following one's intellectual curiosity and open exploration and broad data sharing, all of these are not value free. And I'm not saying that these values are diametrically opposed to public values. They absolutely aren't. But they need to be taken into account, just like public values need to be taken into account.
And I want to clarify my remarks too. Like Debra, my doctorate is actually in biochemistry. So I, am a natural scientist as well. And so my point was that often we say that regulation is based on sound science, and making a regulatory decision about safety cannot strictly be science. That doesn't mean that there's not really important scientific steps in that process. Like when you go to the lab and you do the toxicological study on the mouse, right? And that you have a control group and you've got variables, and that's a very scientific step. Now the values come in as like, oh, well, what mice do I choose? How many mice are enough? How do I draw the dose response curve? That kind of thing. So I think it's a little more middle ground than maybe I was stating. Sometimes I overstate things to make a point too much, but I certainly value science as well. So, and it plays a super important role. That's why I really like that NRC study in 1996, because it talks about the analytical process and the deliberative process. And sometimes the analytical process is constrained to what you would think of as, objective science, quote unquote. Where you've got your control group and you're just observing the results, So yeah, I hope that clarifies what my point, Keith. Okay, thank you.
And I would just add one thing, and we said this in the New England Journal paper that just came out. Scientists can tell us if we can do something, and hopefully if it's safe, but whether we ought do something is a broader question, and that question's not just for science, but for science in conversation with the public.
Mahmud, you get the final word here in the last minute, I think.
So one of the surprising things from our gene editing public forum that surprised our advisors was that people trust science. So, we do this pre-post survey in all of our things, and two answers are very consistent. Who should make the decision about these things? It's always scientists. But are there enough opportunities for me to participate in that decision making? The answer is no. So I think it's the process. It's not, they still trust the science and the scientists to make the decision, but they want transparency, they want accountability, they want their voices and values heard. That's what they're asking. So I think that's a positive note to end on.
Yeah, I think it's positive. I think I want to acknowledge there are still a couple unanswered questions in the Q&A, and maybe we can get to those via texting some answers. One particular one, we were talking about incentivization with patients for research. It's a little bit interesting question. And then Susan Wolf asked about what do you do when the public knows more about this technology and where it's going than the actual scientists do, which is increasingly going to be the case here. But I want to thank you all for participating in this session, the second session, final one of the day today. So I think Victor has was muted his video, I suppose. I don't know what the verb is there. So I guess that means I turn it back over to Victor. Thank you.
What an amazing panel and discussion. If I can do the applause, I'll do this like this. And what a great day so far as we offer a great start. Exactly what we hope that we can accomplish, and having this really amazing dialogue. And tomorrow you hear a little bit more about specific framework that we put together for your input, and of course launching the consent study. So thank you very much. I believe we start at 11 o'clock Eastern time tomorrow.
At 1 p.m.
Oh, 1 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow, pardon me. Atul, I'm thinking like you. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. It's 1 p.m. tomorrow Eastern time. Bye-bye.